Hello, and welcome to our Chapter 2, Evolution, Constructing a Fundamental Scientific Theory. Today we're going to talk about how we came to the theory of evolution. I know we tend to look at that man there on the right, Darwin, as being the guy ultimately responsible for that, but he was just one in a chain of many, and the fact that he came up with the idea and shortly afterwards another came up with the idea tells us that it was kind of long in coming. So we're going to talk today about how did the idea come to be, what did Darwin do, and what's happened since. As a result, this lecture is going to be quite a bit longer than the previous two lectures that you've looked at. And I apologize for that, but it's a lot of information to get through. You know, we're all kind of, we're talking about something that's very, very important, this evolution through common ancestry, and it's very important to me that you understand how the mechanisms work and how they don't work. You'd be surprised how often people have gone through biology classes or other classes and totally missed how the process actually works. The National Science Foundation did a poll where they talked to a bunch of different people about what they understood the theory of natural selection to be and how evolution worked, and what they found out was only 20% of the people who claimed to have an understanding actually understood it correctly. This is because it's kind of a complex idea, and we tend to be kind of soundbite people. We like everything in a 2-minute explanation, and unfortunately this particular topic doesn't lend itself to that, as you're going to see throughout this lecture. Okay, so before Darwin, we had some ideas. This is kind of the spoiler slide, if you will. Before Darwin, we had some ideas about what kind of our world existence was like. We believed things like the Earth was very young, and that all species on the planet had been put here in their current form by a creator, and we're going to go through today how we came to those conclusions, and then we're going to be talking about how we changed our mind through experiment and through observation. So now we have to go into the way back machine. We're going to go all the way back into the 16th century. We're actually going to go even further without the benefit of a TARDIS, I'm afraid. So during the 16th century, science starts taking the course that it gets to today. Now, you may ask, why did it take so long? How come it took until the 16th century, I mean, we're talking about Queen Elizabeth on the throne, before we started understanding how the world really worked? Well, this had a lot to do with who was in control of ideas and how ideas got propagated. Let's talk about the job of scholar for a second. So if you were a scholar, you were most likely a monk. Note that I also didn't include nuns. Women weren't really allowed to at that point. But you were most likely a monk, because monks were the ones who had the time to sit and think about the nature of the universe and philosophize about why things are the way they are. It wasn't until the 16th century where we start really having, if you will, a class of idle people. People who weren't farmers but owned farms and had a aristocratic bent, if you will. Lots of those people were idle, and some of them took that idle time and considered the meaning of life for them. So we start seeing scientists question the rigidity of the universe, the idea that just because the church, and there were multiple churches, we're not just talking about Christianity here, but that the church said that, you know, it was so and so it is so. So they began to sort of look at those laws, if you will, that had been laid down about the nature of the universe, and they really started to question them. One of the things that they were questioning at that point was the idea that every species that had been on the planet was still there, that there was no such thing as extinction. Part of this was because they were being presented with actual evidence and facts that that was not the case. most likely it was in the form of fossils. So we'll talk about that a little bit later, but you do need to know that at this point they believe that the sun revolves around the Earth, not the other way around. They already know the Earth's not flat, but this is important, this idea that the sun revolves around the Earth. This gives you an idea of the general attitude about our place in the universe. We are the center of the universe in this ideology before it changes. And this has to do with believing that a divine creator would put us in the center of the universe because from our perspective, we are the most important organism. This is going to change. But let's go to where the heck we got that idea in the first place. I mean, ideas just don't spring out of the ground like corn, right? So if we go back, way back to between 384 and 322 BC, we go back to a guy named Aristotle. Aristotle was a philosopher. Now, that doesn't mean the same thing as it means today. A philosopher at that time was a thinker, and what they did was think about everything. If you were a philosopher, you were also a doctor, like a medical doctor, and an astronomer, and a botanist, and a theologian. Basically, a smart person who could talk about anything. Now, you know with your own experience that you, in these days and times, we specialize. We specialize in ideologies or in professions. Like, I'm not going to ask my doctor, my medical doctor, I'm not going to ask him about some sort of astrological or astronomical phenomenon. I'm just not going to. It's a different branch of understanding. So at the time, Aristotle, who talked about a lot of things, one of the things he talked about was this idea that every creature on the planet met a grand design, a purpose, if you will. His evidence for this was the book of Genesis, which most of you know is the foundational text for Christianity, for Judaism, for Islam. It's a very old text. And in this text, one of the statements is that the divine creator creates every animal for man. Remember that whole we're the center of the universe thing? That every animal is here for us. The other component that he expands upon is this idea that if we were to, let's say, overhunt an animal, let's say we'd get all the deer in the forest, and we kill all of those deer, they will come back because our divine creator made them for us, so we will have more of them. This is I like to think of this as the vending machine philosophy of God. Obviously, since everything's here for us, we can eat it all up, use it all up, doesn't matter, it will get it back. And that attitude has been prevailing for, well, a couple thousand years now, and look at where we are today as a result of that attitude. Then we get in the 2nd century AD, we get Ptolemy, that P is silent, and Ptolemy says that, in fact, not only is every animal that has ever been here to meet our purposes, there are no changes in animals. No animal becomes another animal. You see, we're already asking the question in the 2nd century AD, how do animals change? And he answers, nope, they don't change. They are exactly as they have always been. This is because they haven't encountered any counter evidence to that, and they've interpreted Genesis to say that. All right, so now we're going to go, when does the change happen? We're going to start with 1514 and Copernicus. Copernicus says, hey, actually, we're not the center of the universe, the sun is. That's what heliocentric means. The sun is the center of the universe, and the Catholic Church says that's heresy, and if you don't take it back, we will burn you. And Copernicus, being allergic to fire, like all people are, says, yeah, you're right, I was wrong, sorry, must have made a mistake in my calculations. Then comes Galileo. Now, Galileo is famous for many things, but one of the things that I love most about him is that he was a very cantankerous man. I mean, he was not above yelling at the Pope, and he was very, very, very convinced that Copernicus was right. He's, of course, right. In fact, much of what Galileo said was considered heretical, and he was not allowed to be buried in sacred ground because of his commitment to his ideals. He was actually pardoned in the late 1990s and moved to sacred ground, but at the time, the church and he were directly opposed to each other. In the 17th century, we get another change. It's kind of a philosophical change, this time actually in philosophy. That guy right there that I have a picture of, that's a drawing of Rene Descartes. Descartes is the guy who said, "I think, therefore I am." Now, why this is important, every little kid wonders, how do they know what they see is real? How do they know their perceptions are real? How do you know you're not a doll in a giant's playhouse? How do you know? The question itself, not unique, but the answer he came to was the act of thinking makes it real, makes me real. And we've been kind of tangling with that idea ever since. Think about Inception and other movies like that, this idea of what makes real. I mean, even Fight Club, what is real? So with this, we move forward in science with Newton. Newton, as you know, is the guy who describes the laws of gravity. That apple falling out of the tree thing, that didn't happen. He didn't discover gravity. Every 2-year-old who ever drops a cup discovers gravity. But he describes the mechanism, how it actually happens. And this is kind of starts being how we do science. We say, okay, a thing happens. Now we ask how. So Kepler, in 1609, he's a physicist, he realizes, oh, actually, even Copernicus was wrong. We are heliocentric. There's absolutely, the sun is in the center of our small solar system, but our orbits are elliptical, which means they go long ways around. So if you look at that very top of the diagram there, you see Copernicus's idea there with a sort of all the ellipses are all the orbits are circular, and then if you look at the right, you see they're elliptical. So it was testable and confirmable, and we went on. So now we're going to get to a guy named John Ray. John Ray is, he's concerned with animal breeding. He wants to know how you know which animals can breed with which. And he coins the term genus and species. This term is, later we're going to be using this term a lot, but that's because of another guy. So what he says is, two animals are the same species if they can breed and produce fertile offspring. They are different species if they can breed, make offspring, but the offspring cannot make offspring. So the classic example, which I'm sure you already are familiar with, is the horse and the donkey, right? You put them together, you get a mule. In fact, we actually use the term mule to be synonymous with sterility. That means that a horse and a donkey are not the same species. And in this picture here, I have a Ligra. And in this little example, we know that tigers and lions are different species. They can make babies like this Ligra or Tylons, but their babies don't make babies. What's interesting about this is that when we science it up a little bit and we take the gametes from lions and tigers and put them together and make Tylons and Ligras, and then we take their gametes and put them together, it turns out we can actually make babies. We can make babies that make babies, which means that Tylons and Ligras are not actually infertile, and that lions and tigers may actually be the same species. But we take a different tack on this. They do something we would call behavioral speciation, which means that no animal will mate with a Tylon or a Ligra. Tylons and Ligras, you can put them with lions, you can put them with tigers, you can put them with Tylons and other Tylons and Ligras and other Ligras, and they do not make babies. Nothing will mate with them. And that's an important distinction. So we consider them still separate species because the only way we can get an additional offspring out of the Ligra or the Tylon is through artificial means. So that we leave them within their own genus and species. But boy, I don't think John Ray could have ever even imagined that that would have happened. So now we're coming to Carolus Linnaeus. he's had a huge impact on science. I mean, huge. If we look at what he did, he came up with the classification system that we still use today. We use the base of it anyway. We've expanded it. You know, that whole kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species thing where you have kings play chess on fun girl stomachs. That's the how to remember it. I'm sure you learned it in like 6th grade or something like that. And he came up with this system. And he did it actually because he was a profoundly religious man. In the book of Genesis, it talks about how Adam was to name all the creatures, and he felt that all the creatures had not been named appropriately and hierarchically. He kind of made this nesting system, and because of that, it was his job to name all the animals, flowers, plants, the whole thing. He was going to name everything. And he actually did a really good job. Take, for example, that animal you see there on the right, that little ugly sort of looks like a irradiated hamster thing. It's actually called a tarsier. And Linnaeus said that a tarsier was in between a loris and a monkey. Now, there is a loris that looks almost exactly as ugly as this thing does, and in the 1970s we put tarsiers over with the lorises and the lemurs because of their physical similarities. In the late 1990s, we actually did something called DNA hybridization, which is when you unzip a molecule of DNA from one animal and unzip a molecule from another animal, and then you zip the two halves from each of those animals together. When you put those together, if the animal is unrelated, if the two animals you're putting together are unrelated, it doesn't take very much heat to unzip them. The closer related they are, the more heat it takes. So for the lemurs and lorises, it turned out it took very little heat to get the tarsier DNA off. And for the monkeys, it took a lot more heat, which meant they were more closely related to monkeys than they were to lemurs and lorises. So Linnaeus was right all those hundreds of years ago. It actually created a huge renaming system in primatology, which we'll talk about in a few weeks. One of the things that Linnaeus did get wrong, though, was he'd put humans in this classification system. That wasn't wrong. But within our human classification, while he recognized that everybody was the same species, he made a hierarchy based on skin color, which was regrettable, to say the least. So we're going to take a little side note here for a second, and we're going to be looking at taxonomy and systematics. This drawing is a little bit small, so you're probably going to want to follow along in your text. Your text goes from the bottom up. I'm going to go from the top down. So using Linnaeus's system, we start with our kingdom, that's at the top there. We belong to Animalia. Animalia is one of multiple kingdoms that are possible within our naming system. This is the big picture going down to the little picture. So we are mobile, multicellular organisms, and we eat other organisms. That's the key there for being Animalia, is that we eat other organisms. Also, that we have an embryo kind of stage. Then we have a subkingdom. This is kind of a new thing. We used to describe it just as, oh, we're kingdom Animalia and we're Metazoic. Now we say we're kingdom Animalia, we're subkingdom Eumetazoa. Eumetazoa includes all the major animals of what used to be Metazoa, but we kicked out all the sponges and corals, because they are actually very different from us. Even though they're multicellular, like we are, made up of multicells instead of being unicellular, they don't have real tissue. And there are no real organs in a sponge or in a coral. So we made Eumetazoa to cover those of us with tissues and organs. And it includes some things you might not expect, like sea stars and platyhelminths, so flatworms. It includes all kinds. In fact, the vast majority of Eumetazoa is worms, but we are in there somewhere, I assure you. Then we are phylum Chordata. This means that we have a notochord, or for us it's a spinal cord, and we also have gill slits at some point in our development. So your gill slits were there during your embryonic stage, and now they make up part of your um, no, I'm sorry, your trachea, and your notochord becomes part of your vertebral column. Sharks are even included in this, and so they're also chordates. And then we're subphylum Vertebrata. Vertebrata means we have uh, a vertebral column and a backbone. So like some sort of series of connecting discs that make up our back. Um, we are also a superclass. I'm pretty sure you didn't get this in sixth grade because we didn't call us that then, which is Tetrapodia. And Tetrapodia is or Tetrapoda is the idea that we have uh, our limbs end in fours. We have 2 hands, 2 feet, or whatever, but we have these extensions on the ends of our limbs. And it's the same for amphibians and dinosaurs and mammals. So we're all still in the same group now. Then we get to class Mammalia, which is, we're of course already vertebrates, you remember that? And we're warm-blooded, and we have fur, and we have mammary glands. That's all mammals. Underneath that, there are really 3 different types of mammals, but we put 2 of them in the same category, which is called Theria. And Theria means that we are, not only are we endothermic, all mammals are endothermic, but we are the ones that give birth to live young without any kind of egg, like a shelled egg. There is a kind of mammal that has a shelled egg. It lays eggs. And those, I consider them kind of the weirdo mammals, and not surprisingly, they're in Australia, which is where the land of weirdo animals lives. So these guys are called monotremes, and they include the echidna and the duck-billed platypus, that guy. They lay eggs instead of live birth. The live birthers are us and all of the marsupials. And marsupials are also mostly, for the most part, on Australia, fairly weird animals, except for our North American marsupial, which you know as the opossum. So these guys have their animals, their babies live. And then we get into the order Primata, which is all primates. This is going to include lemurs, lorises, tarsiers, monkeys, apes. All of those are all in primate. And then below that, we're going to concern ourselves right now with Haplorini, which is going to be the primates that includes monkeys, apes, humans, and tarsiers. Then we go down to the infraorder, which is Anthropoidea, which is going to be specifically humans, apes, and monkeys. Then of monkeys, there are 2 different major groupings, Platyrrhines and Catarrhines, and we are Catarrhini. That means actually that we have downward-facing nostrils. You have to approach our nostrils from beneath our face as opposed to from the front, and that's going to be humans, apes, and old world monkeys. Then we have Hominoidea, which is the humans, the big-bodied apes, the lesser apes like the gibbons and siamangs, and all of our human-like ancestors. Then we have Hominidae, which is the great apes, humans, and the human-like ancestors. We've dropped out the gibbons and the siamangs now. We are subfamily Homininae, which is specifically chimps, humans, and human-like ancestors. This has been a huge change for us. We didn't used to group it this way. We used to put all the large-bodied apes together, but we've discovered within the last 20 years that the chimpanzees are closer related to us by far than they are to gorillas or orangutans or any of the other large-bodied apes. So we get our super family there making that distinction. I'm sorry, subfamily there making our distinction. Then we have tribe, which is sometimes, we call this hominini or sometimes called hominins. So that's kind of our slang. And that's got the humans, the human-like ancestors, anybody who's an obligate biped, anybody who walks on 2 legs pretty much exclusively except during certain periods of our life. And then we're genus Homo, which is, again, modern humans, their direct ancestors, and the extinct relatives, and then sapiens, because there are other human-like ancestors that are not in the genus Homo. Then our species is sapiens, which means wise, and that's modern ancestral humans, and we have been very successful. And then we have the subspecies sapiens, which is because we have had Homo sapiens that are not us. Obviously, we'd be able to breed and produce fertile offspring, but they do not look exactly like us. So therefore, we've put them not in that subspecies, and we will talk about that until you are blue in the face, somewhere around week 10. All right, so now we're back to our intellectual road after that little side trip there. We're going to talk about another guy who was important, the Comte de Buffon. He was the first guy to recognize that the environment seemed to affect how an organism actually looked, like what the climatic conditions were, seemed to affect the overall body of the organism. Now, he wasn't suggesting that one species became another. He did not believe that that was the case at all. But he did believe that somehow the environment impacted the condition of the body. And now we're to my next favorite Darwin, which is Erasmus Darwin. He's Charles's grandfather. He was a doctor and a poet, and he was also a scientist. And he was talking about the way that a species could become another species. He actually was talking about evolution. He wasn't the only one by far. It was an idea that was floating around at the time. And he was working off some of the ideas of a guy named Lamarck, who we're going to come to in a little bit. So one of the things that people often say is that, Charles Darwin was heavily influenced by his relationship with his grandfather, but that's kind of stupid because his grandfather died in 1802 and Darwin was born in 1809. So unless there was some sort of poltergeist thing happening, not really. But Erasmus did leave a bunch of writing behind. Most of it was poetry, and the vast majority of it was actually pretty racy poetry. It would be even racy by today's internet porn standards. But in between all of that, he said something very important, and what he said was that sex matters. And what he meant was that if an animal is unattractive to the opposite sex of the species, so if a male is unattractive to a female, he's not going to be able to pass his traits down to the female. So that in itself was changing species. Do you remember back where we were talking about the Tylons and the Ligras? You can see that having no animal willing to mate with you is significant in the ability to pass down your genes. Now, he doesn't know anything about genes, but he does understand that traits pass on. Everybody already knows this idea that somehow from parents to offspring, the offspring get some of what the parents had. Right, this passing down of traits. You're familiar with it too. You've probably even wondered why maybe your mom has a great nose and your dad has a bad one, and you got the bad one, and you're like, oh, why me? Well, that's questions people were asking. Now, some of it was based on commercial ideas because, like how do you get the kind of breed of dog that people want, or a horse, or a flower? How do you get those things? And so people are talking about it from a very practical sense. Now we get to geology, and in geology we get this contesting of a very central idea that people have. At this point, people believe that the Earth is very young from our perspective. And why they believe this is they are basing it entirely on a Christianity biblical belief. So there was this guy named Archbishop Usher, and he went through the Christian Bible, and he started with Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel, and he kind of went through the begats, Adam and Eve begat Cain and Abel, etc. And he counted about 25 years per generation, unless it was somebody like Moses or Methuselah, who were supposed to have lived for a very long time. And from that, he came to the conclusion that the earth was 4,004 years old at the time of his writing. What was interesting was he started with the idea that it was 4,004 years old. It took him 12 years to count, and at the end, he still came up with 4,004 years old. So not really sure what exactly he was doing, but that's was rooted in the belief of every man, woman, and child, was that the earth was not very old. Where James Hutton comes in is he says, actually, if you look, it takes environmental forces to make soil, and if you look at what the forces are, they are rain and they are wind and they are volcanic activity and all those things. And he says those things have always been happening. And he comes up with this theory of uniformitarianism, which was previously associated with Lyell, but it's actually James Hutton's idea. So, if you were to suggest in the 1600 that the earth was more than a few thousand years old, people would just laugh at you. And in fact, if they weren't trying to catch you and set you on fire. But James Hutton basically says, we've got this strata, right? Look at these layers here, and these layers take a very long time to lay down. And if you look, getting 4,004 years is only about 1.5 feet. What about all these other layers? Which is what Charles Lyell essentially did. Charles Lyell, who's considered the father of modern geology, but it really actually should be James Hutton. If you look at this picture right here, you can see Bryce Canyon there in Utah with all of its many, many strata. And Charles Lyell basically says, oh yeah, no, for sure, look at this strata. It's going to take not thousands of years, but millions of years to make this go. As a person today, oh, the Earth's 4.6 billion years old. Oh, okay, cool. But that was not common knowledge. So this was kind of a big deal. And Charles Lyell was pretty much the guy who got all the respect for it. Again, it was kind of a classism issue that we don't have time for here. So if we go on to paleontology, we get kind of our first real paleontologist with a guy named Robert Hooke. Robert Hooke exists in the 17th century. He dies just at the beginning of the 18th, and he's actually the inventor of the microscope. And what he sees in fossil wood, he looks at the microscope and he goes, oh, the cells are the same as living wood today. And so he says, oh my gosh, these organisms that we're finding in stone were once alive. I know, right? You're like, of course they were once alive. I've known that since I was 3. Well, that's actually thanks to this guy that we understood then in I think he was in just before 1700, that the things that were embedded in fossils, or the things that are fossils, were actually living creatures. This is going to present people with a problem, though, because as the 17th century into the 18th century, into the 19th century, as people are digging to make buildings and basements and corridors and all those things, what did they find? Well, they found fossils. They found fossils of animals that didn't currently exist. You remember that whole fixity of the species thing? Every animal that's ever been here has been here because it meets a grand design, etc., etc. Well, this presented a problem. Well, then, especially when they hit their first dinosaur, like if every animal that's ever been here is still here, where are the thunder lizards, right? Where do these things come from? Why don't we see them? Well, Charles Cuvier to the rescue. Oh, sorry, George Cuvier to the rescue. He said, actually, organisms can go extinct. But his explanation for their extinction was kind of funny. And he says, look, there's different fossils and different geographic strata, the way that, Hutton and Lyell described it, but they're not there because we hunted them or anything like that. They're in these layers because of biblical floods. He specifically points out, he says, in this geographic strata, particularly probably around 40,000 years ago, because he does believe that that the Earth is older. He says, you know, when God wiped out the planet and started over again, which most of us know as the story of Noah, right? God talks to Noah and he tells him to build an ark, and he's supposed to collect the animals two by two, you know, one male, one female, put them on the ark, and then he's going to wipe the planet clean. And Cuvier says that these fossils are basically the animals that didn't get on the ark. Which leads me to one of my favorite Robot Chicken episodes. I don't know if you're a fan of Robot Chicken. It has, I will admit, gone off the rails. But in season 1, there's this episode where you have unicorns and minotaurs and dragons and centaurs and cyclopses and these guys. And basically the joke is they don't get on the boat because Noah tells them the wrong time. And he leaves earlier than them so that they'll die, and he says it's because God hates a freak, right? So it's Cuvier humor, and I quite appreciate that. All right, now we're taking what looks like a side run, but it isn't. So we're going to be in that Wayback Machine for a minute. When the Industrial Revolution happens, and even a little bit before that, what we see happening as a demographic trend is that out of the country, in England and Ireland and Scotland and Italy and France and all the places where we used to have more rural living, where people didn't own their land but they worked for other people who did, when opportunities came up in the city, they would basically move to the cities. When you got large amounts of people together in the cities, remember their sanitation's different than ours is now. They throw their poop out the windows. There's bacteria rife. One of the worst of them is something called Mycobacterium tuberculosis, which results in tuberculosis. So you get a bunch of people together, over 10,000, you start seeing episodes of tuberculosis. If you're a fan of Victorian literature, it's sometimes called consumption. If you're watching Penny Dreadful, it's what Brona Croft dies of. She's coughing up blood. So consumption was a big problem, and it was particularly a problem for those of lower socioeconomic classes. So the poor, for example, they were regularly dying off in droves from malnutrition, from lack of sunlight, from tuberculosis. But it was really scaring the rich people that their servants were up and dying on them, and that there were dead people in the streets, and so they became very, very nervous. Enter Thomas Malthus. Thomas Malthus was a natural scientist initially, and he became an economist. And he said, look, rich people, it's okay. Don't panic. And he really basically wrote for rich white guys. He said it's actually quite good that these deaths are occurring. These deaths take away the people who are less fit, basically. And he doesn't mean fit like they've exercised enough. He means the people who are less rich or otherwise capable of taking care of themselves. So he points out that food supply never increases at the rate of human populations. That normally, here, I'll show you the diagram. So here, if you look at this diagram, it's you might want to check it out in your book a little bit closer, because this is obviously a little bit tiny. But the first thing he says is that for every organism, every pair of parents usually produces multiple offspring, right? And for if you look, most organisms, their populations stay the same even though they make all of these organisms. There's no real increase over time. And he says that's because they're limited by the food supply. Members of the population are going to compete for food, and the ones that are best able to compete are going to be the ones who are going to eat. He also notes that he's talking specifically about people. If you look at this chart here, it's talking about what Darwin's taking from Malthus. But what he's really taking is this idea that when there's not enough resources, individuals will compete for resources, which is really what Malthus was talking about. Because he said, okay, Malthus says, all right, so human populations reproduce exponentially, which means 2 times 2 is 4, 4 times 4 is 16, 16 times 16, etc. Whereas food supply, even in the best hands, only reproduces arithmetically. 2 plus 2 is 4, 4 plus 4 is 8, and so we quickly have two lines that are parting there, where we have bigger populations than we can support. And so Malthus was basically arguing it's okay, we have a surplus population, let them die. Obviously this wasn't intended for distribution among people who were the dying, but pretty much if you were a rich white male during the time period of Malthus's life and beyond, you read this article. It sort of helped you to embrace your entitlement, if you will. Sometimes people associate these concepts with Darwin, but Darwin wasn't the one who said it originally, it's Malthus. So every time you hear people going, oh, poor people should die, there's just too many of them, and someone calls that social Darwinism, it's not. It's actually Malthus's idea. And we even have Malthus in pop culture too. Well, not pop culture, but popular-ish culture. I'm sure at Christmas you'll watch A Christmas Carol. It's our cultural tradition. And if you will recall, because I'm sure you've seen it before, there's a point when two men come into Scrooge's office to ask him to donate to charity, and he says, oh, are there no workhouses? And they say, oh, but some would rather die, sir. And he says, good, then let them die and reduce the surplus population. He's directly quoting Malthus there, because as a man of means, he would have read Malthus. So that's kind of a little history sideline, and it doesn't seem important right this second, I know, but he's going to be the match that starts the fire. So let's put him aside for a second. Okay, now we're going to talk about Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. He's the guy who, he doesn't invent evolution, neither does Darwin, but he sort of starts talking about the mechanisms that could make it happen. By the way, he's completely wrong. And sadly, a bunch of people still believe the way he thinks about things is right because they don't understand. Like, if you've ever heard somebody say, like, oh, you're going to lose your appendix because you don't use it, or you don't use your pinky toe, so you're going to lose it. That's the idea of use and disuse, which comes directly from Lamarck, and it's wrong. What we do get from Lamarck is A, he is the first guy to try to explain how it works, even if he's wrong. And B, he's the first guy to coin the term biology. He's the reason we call it biology. So down there you'll see some little giraffes plucking at branches. I'm going to show it to you a little bit bigger. His idea is you have sort of short-necked giraffes, and they start eating all the food around them. They will eat all the food, and they will need to reach higher food because they've eaten all the food at their level. So they will stretch their necks and stretch their necks, and because they really want it, and because they really need it, special organs and fluids are going to go to their neck and make it grow. I realize this sounds stupid, but he had this idea that if you used a thing, it improved, and if you didn't, it disappeared, and then it would pass to your offspring if you used it and it improved. So here you have this short-necked giraffe, and he eats all the stuff, and he really, really wants to eat. So he moves his head, and he stretches it, and he stretches it, and he gets another little, fraction of a neck, and then he could reach the new food. And when his child is born with the same size neck he achieved. And this continues on through generations. Lamarck had a problem, though, because he believed that the Earth was young, and he couldn't figure out how we would get to this much change over such a short period of time. But that's neither here nor there. The issue is that the offspring get the characteristics the parent acquired. So this would be like if your parents played piano, great manual dexterity, and they were great piano players, you would be born with the ability to play piano. You weren't, right? So he also has evolution happening to the individual, which it actually doesn't. Evolution happens to populations, not individuals, which I realize right now a little hard to wrap your head around, because you go, populations are made up of individuals. Yeah, they are, but I'll straighten that out for you in a bit. Let's look at the difference real quick between how Lamarck thought it works and how it actually works. So if we look at the line across the top, you see some short-necked giraffes, and they stretch their necks and stretch their necks, and they get to eat, and they have babies who have the necks that were stretched to their length, etc., etc. You see how that works. Now look at the bottom line and you see there's a short-necked giraffe and a medium-necked giraffe, and the short-necked giraffe can only eat what he can reach, and the medium-necked giraffe can reach what the short-necked guy can reach and further. So the short-necked guy, you'll see in the very next picture, is dead. He wasn't able to get enough food and he wasn't able to reproduce because he didn't get enough food. So the medium-necked guy, he survives, and because there's always variation in a population, there's even taller necked guys who can outcompete him, and in that third picture you see him outcompeted and he's dead, and the ones that were taller necked were able to reach the higher branches and therefore make more babies that had babies and survive. We'll come back to this idea over and over again, but that's really how it actually works. So coming back to your appendix, you don't actually use your appendix, so are you going to lose it? Well, no, that's not how it works. Actually, the only way you would lose your appendix is if it became impossible for you to breed because you had an appendix. Now, that actually would have happened in our society if we didn't have modern medicine. Modern medicine leads to us not having that problem. So let's say you have an appendix and it goes nuclear. You end up having an appendicitis and it's going to explode and it'll kill you. Right? So that usually happens when you're a teenager, if it's going to happen at all. So you have this, oh God, what do you do? Well, you go to the ER and they take it out. Now, if we didn't have doctors, we actually probably would have eventually evolved without appendixes because it would have killed us before we bred. Having that appendix that goes nuclear kills us before we breed unless, we intervene. But because that's not the case anymore, we won't be born without appendixes. That just won't happen. And again, you absolutely use your little toe. Oh, another possibility about little toes, though, just thinking about it. If having a little toe made you unsexy. So let's imagine a world where some people have 4 toes and some people have 5, right? And this is, by the way, a real world. Some people do have 4 toes. Some people have 6. So 5 is the usual, but we have variation. So let's say having 5 toes made you gross, right? So you go home with a lady and you turn on the I don't know, turn on the soft music or the Barry White, right? And it's time to get to business, and she looks at your feet and she goes, oh my God, 5 toes. No, puts on her clothes and leaves. Okay, so if that were to happen, if you became unmateable because of your 5 toes, yeah, we would see a population that doesn't have 5 toes. Yeah, that would totally happen. Because remember what Erasmus said? That actually turns out to be important. So we're going to move on. Now, back to that intellectual road. Here's a really unfortunate event that occurred. It's not discussed in your textbook, but I think you should know it, which is, okay, so we're back in the Wayback Machine. We're in France, and as you know, there was a revolution, right? You've watched Les Mis and all of that, and there's a king on the throne, and he sucks, and the population doesn't know what to do because, according to their belief system, kings are put there by God. It's called the divine right of king. A king is put on the throne by God, and only God can remove him. You understand that means that if you hate your king and you go to kill him, you are going against God. So a bunch of socialists who also happen to be atheists were like, hey, what if there is no God? If there is no God, he's just a guy and we can kill him. So they use as a replacement for God science. And this particular choice that they made, this particular move, this political move they made, we are still suffering from the after effects today. So literally, the mistakes that some Frenchmen made in their political machinations still lead us to having this fight today. It's still an issue within our current politics today because this happened back then. What they did was they put up Lamarck as their poster child. Lamarck was science, and science then replaces God. But that's a false dichotomy. Again, microwaves and Shakespeare, man, they had nothing to do with each other. And yet, this happens then, and we are still suffering like abused children. It's time. We're finally on to Darwin. Time to talk about, well, one of the heroes of this story. This is Darwin. I know, kind of a shocker. He was a young man once. Look at that. I know you're used to the old man picture of Darwin, but there was a young Darwin. And this young Darwin was born in 1809. He dies in 1882. He comes from a family of money. His mom was a Wedgwood. Wedgwood is a very, even today, a very popular and very expensive pottery. So his mom was the one with the money. His dad married his mom as a nice match. His dad was a doctor. You remember that his grandfather was a doctor too. This actually tells you something about them. In this time, they believed, or they had something called primogeniture, which meant that the first son inherited everything, and every son that comes after inherits nothing. Nothing. Primo. First guy gets everything, remaining sons get nothing, but you always have an heir and a spare. You always have extra sons, just in case that first guy dies. So when Darwin sort of comes of age and it's time to pick a profession, his father says, you can be a doctor like me. Let's be doctors. You know, her grandfather was a doctor, I was a doctor, which tells you that they're all second sons. And Darwin says, okay, I'll go be a doctor. So here's the thing, though. Darwin had been raised with a lot of money, and he'd been really idle most of his life. So he had bad habits, like he liked to bet on horses. He liked to bear bait. This is when you put a dog and a bear in a pit together and you have them fight. So he also liked to drink, and what he didn't really like was going to class. I can't really say that I blame him, but he wasn't really good about showing up. So he got kicked out of school. And he was like, okay, you know, I'm actually okay with that. You see, the second job you could have as a rich young kid is you could become a country parson. This is like being a pastor. They're allowed to marry, they get an income every year, and it's a kind of quiet life, but Darwin was despite all of his behaviors, was actually a very, very devoutly religious man. And so he felt like, okay, my job is to serve God. I'll do this. So he goes to theology school. Unfortunately, he doesn't change his student behavior. He's still betting, gambling, drinking, actually kind of messing around with ladies. He's doing some stuff, and he gets kicked out again. Well, now he's in trouble, because you see, the third job that the son who isn't the heir has is he can become a soldier. He would become an officer because of his money, but he'd be a soldier. And he didn't want that. No way, no how. So he goes back to the first school and he says to his teacher, his favorite teacher, and he says, please help me. Please admit me back to the school, or I'm going to have to become an officer. And the teacher says, I can't help you. But what I can do is I can help you run. Here's what I know. I have a friend. He's a captain of a ship, and he needs a companion to go with him. Now, the job of a captain meant that he could not fraternize with his crew. Couldn't talk to them like friends. Couldn't hang out with them at dinner. That was bad. It messed up the system of power. So they often had people come along whose specific job was be captain's friend. So Darwin disappears from his family on the 27th of December, 1831. He goes right after Boxing Day, and he gets on the ship and he goes basically on a 5-year voyage. Now, I'm sure you've all heard about him going on the Beagle and that he was the naturalist, but that actually wasn't his first job. His first job was to be the captain's friend. He brought along with him a bunch of articles so they could have gentlemanly talks in the evening, and I'm sure you've seen enough television to see, you know, those kinds of things occur. And then they hit upon a problem. The problem was the captain didn't like Darwin. Or perhaps he liked Darwin. There's a secondary story that he liked Darwin in a different way than Darwin wanted to be liked. He perhaps wanted something else from Darwin, and so he was in trouble. By the time they hit the Horn of Africa, he knows he is in deep trouble. because if he can't get along with the captain is going to put him off the ship. And so he's got a choice. He can write to his dad and ask his dad to send money to get him home, and he's going to have to go home and be a soldier, or he can think of something. And he does. The guy who's the naturalist on the ship, actually, as it turns out, is a terrible naturalist. He's bad at his job. And Darwin was always actually a fairly good naturalist. A naturalist is what we would now call a biologist. So you have to be able to draw. The guy couldn't draw. You had to make good observations. The guy made terrible observations. But what the guy was more inclined to be the captain's special friend. So it all worked out in the end. So then Darwin ends up being the naturalist, and he's actually very, very good at it. So here you see, the middle-aged Darwin. The guy you saw before was the young Darwin, the 22-year-old who got on the boat. And you can see up in the right the sort of tour that they take. I always sort of hear Gilligan's Island in there as they're going along on the Beagle. So he agreed to do a 5-year tour, and so he goes around, and one of the places that they go to is the Galapagos Islands. While he's in the Galapagos Islands, he collects literally thousands of samples of plants and birds. If you go to Britain and you go to the British National Museum, they actually have some of his birds tagged in his own hands. He also collected fossils and rocks and a bunch of other stuff. One of the most important observations he makes is this. He sees these birds. We now call them Darwin's finches. He called them Galapagos finches, but we call them Darwin's finches now. If you look, it's fundamentally the same bird, and they each have a different beak. And this beak is specialized to the kinds of food that's available on the islands that they're on. There's a short animation under this week's chapter about these beaks, and I recommend very strongly that you watch it. It'll explain it probably better than I can. So here you have the road to Darwin continuing. He gets back home, and his dad says, "Ugh, you're a mess, and I'm going to marry you off like a woman." And he marries him to his cousin, Emma Wedgwood, who also comes with money, the same sort of way his dad got money. There's a picture of young Emma on the left, and you can see older Emma on the right. It actually was quite a fortuitous marriage for Darwin. He really, really, really loved Emma, and they had multiple kids together. They also had multiple tragedies. Before you go, ew, first cousins, we've married first cousins for... Well, we only stopped about 50 years ago. I mean, Eleanor Roosevelt was named Roosevelt before she married Franklin. So this is not at all uncommon for us as a species, and some cultures still marry cousins. But unfortunately for Darwin and Emma, it did have some consequences for them, and they had some children that died young. And in fact, Darwin went into a Black Depression. But he wrote everything down when he got back from his trip. There's a slide all about it, but we'll come back to that. So he writes all about it, but he doesn't publish. And the reason he doesn't publish is important. For women during the Victorian era, their social standing was everything. If you were shunned, it could have real impact on your life. This is one of the reasons that there's all this social maneuvering that you see in like Pride and Prejudice and all those things that I'm sure you've read and sort of wondered why these people are so strange. It had a lot to do with social standing. And if Darwin published, he could ruin Emma's social standing because of what happened with those French socialists. People had begun to associate the idea of evolution with being even a Satanist. I mean, like, they'd really put these things together. And for Darwin, that wasn't the case at all. He saw studying evolution as actually being in accordance with his belief in God, because what he believed was that essentially that we had been handed this wrapped gift, this beautiful wrapped gift, and that for the last 2,000 years we'd just been staring at the wrapping, talking about how lovely the wrapping was. Wasn't it wrapped beautifully? Wasn't it just a gorgeous package? But we weren't talking about what was inside because we hadn't looked. And he saw evolution as actually looking at the package, that instead of thinking that the gift that he had been given by his creator was a simple gift, that instead it was very, very, very complex, and that talking about the complexity showed what a cool gift it was. Imagine his horror when he finally does publish, and people start calling him an atheist and a bunch of other things. It was crushing for him. So you may wonder why he finally did publish. Well, we'll get to that in a second. First, let's talk about what he actually did. So from Lyell and Hutton, he gets the idea that, yeah, the Earth is old, and he comes up with this concept of what we would call gradualism, that as time passes, species slowly become other species. That's true for some species. For some species, it's actually a punctuated event, but we'll talk about that later too. So from Cuvier, he gets the idea that fossils resemble the living forms and that there has been some form of extinction. From Malthus, he puts together those ideas about reproduction, population checks to positive increase, and he applies it back to biology instead of to people, and it really was Malthus that tipped him off. Remember, I had that article when he was on the Beagle, and he was reading it while he was going through the Galapagos, and so it sort of was the match that had him thinking along the lines that was necessary to get to the ideas about natural selection. And from Linnaeus and Lamarck, he gets the idea that species are related to each other, possibly hierarchically, and that species can change. So now, while he's not publishing, he's writing everything down, but he's not publishing. Everybody knows he's working on it. Like, his friends include a guy named Thomas Huxley, and there are other folks within intellectual circles, the Linnaean Society. He's talking about his ideas with other scientists, but he's not publishing. They know what he thinks. Everybody knows what he thinks. In fact, actually, he does publish something. He publishes a 15-volume series on barnacles. And in fact, it's still the most comprehensive series on barnacles that exists today. And in it, he actually, like a code, hides the theory of natural selection. A sentence here, a sentence there. You'd literally have to have all 15 volumes together to get it. And then another basic tragedy strikes, aside from his depression over the death of his children. And it's this guy. This guy, his name is Alfred Wallace. He eventually becomes Lord Alfred Wallace. He was not as wealthy as Darwin, and he had was also idle, and he'd gone off to the Malayan archipelago, which is in Indonesia, and he got malaria. And when he traveled, like gentlemen of the time did, he traveled with a bunch of stuff. And one of the things he took with him was this article by Malthus. So he gets this fever, and in the fever, he puts together Malthus's checks to increase, positive checks to increase the struggle for existence, with what he has seen in Indonesia in animals. He writes it down in 7 glorious sentences. They're beautiful. And he sends it to Darwin, and he asks Darwin what he thinks. Darwin, of course, panics. Absolutely panics. Because this was his idea, and this pipsqueak kid is now got his idea, and he's not going to get the credit for it. So the two of them present joint papers to the Linnaean Society, and ultimately the credit for the idea is given to Darwin because of his previous publications in the books on barnacles. So he I didn't give you the slide, sorry. He then he doesn't really go into obscurity. He continues to publish and write, but it's really Darwin who gets the credit for this. So Darwin publishes On the Origin of Species in 1859. If you'd like a copy of it, it's free on the Gutenberg Press. I usually have one on my phone. I like to use it as a sleep aid. Darwin was a very wordy man. I'm kind of sad in some ways that Wallace didn't get to be the guy, because Wallace wrote so much clearer. But we got Darwin, so that's it. So let's actually talk about what Darwin said. So he says all species are capable of producing offspring faster than food supply. And you know that comes directly from Malthus. Remember that from the previous slide. Then he says all living things show variation, and no two individual species, as well as no two individuals within a species, are exactly alike. See this picture right there of the ladybugs? They're all ladybugs, right? And you'll notice that they have different patterns of spots on their back, showing you variation within the species. This variation is important. Remember back to the giraffes, how there were some sort of shorter and medium and longer neck giraffes, and the longer neck giraffes are the ones that survive. They survive because the environment favored that particular variation. If we look at the rest of what he says, because the population grows bigger than the food supply, only those with a favorable variation are going to survive to produce offspring. So the environmental context determines if a trait's beneficial. Okay, what that means is whatever the context of the environment is, whatever the environmental pressure is, will determine whether or not a trait is good or bad for the environment. So imagine you're a polar bear for a moment. Polar bears should be white, right? Because they live in snow. Well, as you know, the polar ice caps are melting, and a lot of what used to be snow is now rock. And it's much harder for the polar bear to hunt than it used to be. It used to be they blended in with the snow and their prey didn't see them coming. Well, now their prey sees them coming. And as a result, far fewer of them are surviving. Now, some polar bears are born brown. Not really dark brown, but like a yellowy brown. And previously they were selected against, even though there was always some born that way, they were selected against because when the snow was everywhere, the prey could see them coming. Now the prey doesn't see them coming as well. So we're seeing a shift in polar bear fur color. So when it was icy, the trait that was important, white fur. When it becomes warmer, the trait that's important, darker fur. Also the amount of body fat. Polar bears that are fatter used to do really, really well. Now polar bears that are thinner do really, really well. So it's the environmental context that determines if a trait's beneficial. And then, of course, these favorable variations are passed on. If you have the trait that lets you survive to breed, you're the one who gets to pass your traits on, right? Okay. Over long periods of geological time, these traits are going to generate new species. So this is gradualism, this idea that it's going to take long periods of time for species to change, which is true for some, but not for all. So one of the problems that Darwin had with his understanding is he didn't know where variation came from. He knew all things had to have variation, but he didn't know how they got it. Part of it had to do with people's misunderstanding of how breeding worked and their misunderstanding of how women contributed to this. Darwin said this fierce struggle for survival doesn't include women. This is because women at the time were literally hampered by their fashion, what was considered appealing, and it made them seem very frail. His wife seemed frail. They wore these corsets, and I don't know if you've ever put one on. Males, I imagine, probably never. Females, probably not a real corset, probably a Victoria's Secret or a Fredericks of Hollywood corset, but a real corset, a real boned corset, moves your organs. So their ideal waist size was 14 inches. Try to imagine how you get a 14-inch waist. Well, you cinch this piece of fabric with this structure inside. You cinch it down. Well, your organs have to go somewhere. So some of your organs get pushed under your lungs and some go down into your reproductive organs. And as a result, they had diminished lung capacity. So if a woman got scared or excited or cried, she frequently passed out because she was unable to get enough oxygen in her lungs. You can literally trace our right to vote to the stopping of wearing corsets. So this was really important. And so Darwin, I mean, he can't really be blamed, but he thought women had nothing to do with this, which is really stupid. That's missing half of the equation. He also had no idea how parents transmitted their favorable traits onto their offspring, and he didn't understand why it didn't happen every time. How come some of the offspring didn't get the trait? How come some of them were still ending up with the bad trait? And the reason he didn't understand was the guy who was figuring it out hadn't figured it out yet. They didn't know each other. So here, go back for a second. The idea of this law of segregation, and then also the law of independent assortment. We'll come back to those. Don't worry. So with Mendel's theory of heredity, and by the way, he does read Darwin's Origin of the Species. With Mendel's theory of heredity and Darwin's theory of evolution, we can now understand how genes change frequency. How do we get new genes? How come genes vary? Right? So we have to look at how that differential reproduction has to do with evolutionary impacts. How come one versus another? And that's going to really be about natural selection. So if you look at how Mendel worked out how genes can be reshuffled, how do those genes first appear? Well, we end up with a guy named Thomas Hunt Morgan. He did experiments on fruit flies. Fruit flies are actually great for studying evolution because they have a really, really, really fast reproductive cycle. If we're trying to study evolution in people, we have a whole different problem because we have a person's lifespan, and so it's hard for us to study ourselves because we die. But if you look at something like fruit flies, you get new ones every 19 hours. So awesome, keep looking. And so Hunt looks at fruit flies, and he wanted to know about their chromosome, and he found out that genes could change spontaneously, which is we now understand as mutation, which could give us a different eye color or a different wing color or a four-winged fly or a two-winged fly, and then those pass on to future generations. So that's one way to get new genetic information, new variation, like what Darwin didn't get. Here's another example. This is the difference between gene flow and gene drift. So here we have two populations of fishes. If you look on the left side, so one population has one red fish to every 5 goldfish. And in the other population, we see a lot more red fish to goldfish, right? And so where that redfish came from was probably that original population, that population over on the side there. So we have genes moving between populations, and you can see that represented in this case in fish color. In genetic drift, if we take those same fish, the red fish dies in that left-hand column. And so now that population is entirely without red fish. So maybe he's eaten, maybe he dies. It's not important why he dies. It's important that he dies. So before, where we could see we were a 1-to-5 ratio, now we're a 0-to-5 ratio. And so in that small population, we see these changes in allele frequencies, meaning changing in one type to another type, and that happens over generations. Again, why individuals don't evolve, but populations do. We're going to be talking a little bit later, in fact next week, about how we get traits coded from genes, and the fact that these genes are on something called chromosomes, and that the chromosomes themselves are made up of DNA molecules, and that this DNA structure is ultimately what codes for our proteins and for these traits. And just for a second, I'd like you to see the impact of that in a really minor way. So take both of your hands and put them together, clasp your fingers together and interlace your fingers. And when you look down, you'll see that there's a thumb on top. Without unlacing your fingers, cross those thumbs. And when you cross those thumbs, you're going to find out that that feels weird, right? It feels wrong to have the other thumb on top. Why? There's a gene for that. Not all of our genes are about, what color our eyes are or whether or not we like broccoli, but sometimes they're dumb stuff like which thumb goes on top. And all of that is encoded in a series of ever hierarchical embedded codes that make up us. And we share those codes with all of the pretty much all of the organisms on the planet, we have the same set of codes. Some of them we share more of the message together. So for example, a chimp shares 99% of our DNA, but before you get too excited, we share 85% with a chicken. So, and it's because the code only has these few letters, and we use the same words over and over again to mean 20 other words, which we'll talk about next week. I look forward to seeing you then, and thanks for sticking it out.